Hi, I'm Sabrina with Sabrina's Pantry, and I am here to show you how I make whole wheat bread. This is a recipe that I've been making for years, and the recipe came from a family friend who has been making it for decades. So I learned through a lot of trial and error that bread making is not always as easy as it may seem when you look at a recipe. So I wanted to show you all of the little tricks and things that are kind of between the lines of the recipe. So we're going to start out with just putting in the first 5 ingredients in here. And what I do, I've got just plain old vegetable oil, and I'm going to measure in my honey, and I measure it right on top of the oil like this. And the reason I do that is because the oil in the measuring cup makes it so that the honey doesn't stick all over, and so then it comes right out. So you can see there, I've got honey and oil there, and the oil kind of floats to the top, but the honey is still in the oil. And I'm going to do the same thing with my molasses, because the molasses is also sticky. So I'm going to pour the molasses right on top of the oil and honey. And it's 1/3 cup of each, and so it works out really nice. I just use a liquid measuring cup, and I got my oil and the honey and molasses, and they all kind of separate, but the oil will help it all come out. I'm going to dump that into my bowl. And then I'm going to add my salt and my yeast. Now, for the yeast, I prefer to use Fleischmann's yeast. I've tried the Red Star yeast, and I felt like it wasn't as consistent with my bread making, and so my personal preference is Fleischmann's yeast. Once I have those 5 ingredients, I can actually leave these 5 ingredients sitting here kind of indefinitely. So sometimes I'll pre-measure the first 5 ingredients and just let it sit in a couple of bowls if I'm going to do multiple batches. But for this, I'm going to go ahead and add my warm water, and the warm water is what activates everything. Now, the water temperature is very important. If it's too cool, then it won't activate the yeast. If it's too hot, you'll kill the yeast. So I like to do a temperature that's nice, warm, kind of like bath water or water that I would wash my hands in. That's a real comfortable warm water. If it's too hot for me to touch, then it's too hot for the yeast. So we'll pour that in. Give it a little stir. And now you can see it's ready for the first part. I'm gonna show you what it looks like here. So it's pretty separated. You can see the water is kind of sitting on top, but we're gonna give it about 15 minutes to proof. And meanwhile, I will be getting my whole wheat ground, and then we'll come back for the next step. Okay, so about 10 or 15 minutes have passed, and meanwhile I have milled my wheat. And what I like to use for wheat is hard white winter wheat. You can find it in a couple of sources. My favorite 2 sources, my top 2 favorite sources are Montana Milling hard white wheat, which I'm not sure where to get it. I buy it at a store in Utah. And then the other place is you can get it through Thrive Life. They make a really good hard white winter wheat, and I've been really happy with it. And so that gets the most consistent loaves of bread. I've tried a lot of different kinds of wheat and found that there is quite a lot of variety. So I just ran it through my mill and made some flour. So now we're going to go ahead and dump it in. You can see now that my bowl of yeast and everything has been proofing. It's nice and bubbly and frothy. So first thing I'm going to add is my wheat gluten, and I add that just because whole wheat needs a little bit of extra help for the texture, to help make it a smooth texture. And then we'll add our wheat here. Okay, we're going to put it on our mixer. And we're going to start it on low just until the flour gets incorporated. You can see at the beginning of mixing it that it all kind of sits in the bottom of the bowl. This is probably a little bit more flour than I normally mix it with, but it's just sitting at the bottom of the bowl. Doesn't look that interesting, but through the process of mixing, it's going to completely change texture, and we'll show you how that happens. Okay, so I let it mix on high on my mixer for about 10 minutes, and as you can see, the texture has completely changed. I waited until the dough had pulled away from the sides of the bowl and was gathered around the dough hook, and at that point it was ready to turn off. So now I'm going to add my last couple of cups of flour. And this part is the part where a lot of people make mistakes because they add too much flour. So we're going to just add a little bit of flour at a time and test it in between. When I test to see if it has enough flour, I dip my fingers in a little bit of oil, and then I just grab the dough a little bit, and this is actually about right. I can tell because most of the dough came off of my fingers. There's very little still sticking to my fingers, and the texture of it is not too hard. It's not as hard as Play-Doh, but it's not too soft either. It's a good texture, and it's something you'll have to just learn from trial and error. But the main key is that when I dip my fingers in oil and touch it this way, most of it, although there's a little bit on my fingers, most of it stays in the bowl. And that's one of the ways I can tell that I'm there. Okay, now that it's off the mixer, it's ready to rise for a minute. And I'm also done adding any more flour to the dough. So we're gonna put away the flour, and from here on out, we're just gonna be using oil. So I'm gonna pour just a little bit of vegetable oil around the edge, and then I just kind of pull the dough in so that the oil runs down the sides, and then flip it over. And I'm lazy, I don't get another bowl. I don't know if I'm breaking any rules, but I figure the bowl already has the dough in it anyway. So we're gonna let it rise until the dough poofs up above the top of the bowl. It should take about a half an hour because I live in high altitude here. The amount of rising time will vary depending on what altitude you're at. Okay, now that we've had time for our dough to rise, it's ready for the next step. So the important thing to know about this step is that you're not going to use any flour at all to work with the dough. So I've just got plain old oil here, and I'm going to punch the dough down and divide it into 4 equal parts and get it ready to put into the pans. To put the dough into the pan and shape it, we're going to start out by smashing the dough down. The goal is to press out all the extra little air pockets. Then I'm going to start closest to me by folding up one side of the dough and pinching the seam down into the dough. Then I bring the corners in, just the corners, so that we can maintain a good shape. And I'm going to repeat that process over and over, folding up one side and pinching in the corners, and continually smashing out any extra air pockets. It's important to bring the corners in as well, otherwise your loaf will get too long. Once I get to the very last seam, I'm going to really make sure it's pinched together nice. The important thing about that seam is that it's got to be pinched all the way along, otherwise it will unroll much like a cinnamon roll would. Then I can flip it over and put it into my loaf of bread. Now you'll notice the whole time I did this, I didn't use any flour on my hands or on the dough, and that is very intentional. If you use flour on your hands to keep your hands from sticking to it, the flour will make the dough too dry and crumbly. So you only want to use oil at this point for keeping your hands clean. Once everything's in the pan, then I'm going to let it rise for 11 minutes and then bake it in the oven. We are ready for the bread to go into the oven. It has been rising in the pans for 11 minutes, and you can see it has just risen to the top of the pan. One thing to note is your pan size really does make a difference. This is the size of pan I use. You can see they've been used and abused for many years and they're well loved. But if you use a bread pan that's really wide, you're going to get different results. And so I recommend finding a pan that's about this dimension. So we're going to go ahead and put it in the oven and bake for 32 minutes, and then we'll be ready for some fresh bread.